This is Benjamin Gedan at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. We're here to talk about President Mauricio Macri of Argentina's big speech on March 1st at the start of the new Congress in Argentina. The speech was notable for a return to a theme we have heard before, which was essentially the worst is behind us, trust me.
Pero lo peor ya pasó. Y ahora vienen los años en que vamos a crecer. Las transformaciones que hicimos empiezan a dar frutos, a sentirse.
I'm here with Nicolás Saldias, who is a researcher here at the Wilson Center. Nicolás, why was it necessary to make this point once again that the economy has been rough, people have made sacrifices, but yet there's reason for optimism?
So the reason that he did this is because the sentiment on the street is not exactly very good. People's real salaries are still below what they were when Macri entered. Inflation is high still. And employment, although it has increased, it's only marginally higher than it was in 2015. GDP has also marginally gone over its previous peak. What's notable is that the economy is still about the same size as it was in 2011. So Macri only now has superseded the crisis. So I think Macri is saying this to tell the Argentine population that going forward things are going to be getting better, that the worst is behind them. Employment is up. Consumption is up, and industrial production has also gone up recently. Unfortunately, there are also a lot of problems that he will be facing this year. For example, the country will face its worst drought in 30 years, which will complicate the government's fiscal objectives and growth.
The big item that most were listening for in this speech was labor reform, right? It's the major pending element in what has been a fairly dramatic and I think fairly aggressive approach to reform in Argentina. We did hear something, right? We heard some mention of labor reform.
Pero en Argentina, 1 de cada 3 trabajadores está en la informalidad. Y no está ahí porque quiere, hace lo que puede. Vamos a presentar el proyecto de ley de inclusión laboral para que miles de trabajadores informales puedan registrarse sin perder la antigüedad y los beneficios que le corresponden por sus años de trabajo. Esta iniciativa es el fruto del trabajo en equipo entre sindicatos y empleadores, unidos detrás de la meta de cuidar el empleo argentino.
But that's the low-hanging fruit, right? I mean, this idea of an amnesty to help bring some of the informal workers to the formal sector. This is not the meat of labor reform that we've been promised, is it, Nicolás?
It is not. This is a low-hanging fruit. This is the most popular portion of the labor reform, which is the labor amnesty, which would basically turn informal workers, which represent about 33% of the Argentine labor force, and turn them into formal workers. And the way that this is done is that the government would forgive firms any penalties for the formalization of those workers. And it also allow those workers to maintain their benefits and seniority. The issue is that this is not a big reform in terms of the necessity of declining informality. The most important part of it is decreasing the labor costs. Labor costs are not the same as wages. Argentina has the largest tax wedge in Latin America in regards to labor costs. I believe it's upwards of 50% of total labor costs is non-wage. So Macri's core labor reform is not there, which is to reduce those labor costs. For example, Social Security contributions. And so this is the low-hanging fruit, and because it's not including the other elements of the labor reform, it's questionable if it's actually going to have the same effect that he is purporting that it will have.
And I think to improve competitiveness, he had also hoped and in fact pledged that he was going to make it easier to dismiss workers, reduce the chances of litigation and the cost of that, and to have more opportunities for temporary workers. None of that appears on the legislative agenda at this point.
Correct. None of it, according to his speech at the Congress, is there.
Now, he did reference one other aspect of the labor crisis in Argentina.
Nos dimos cuenta de que no sirve seguir culpando a otros de lo que nos pasa, que crecer depende de nosotros, de nuestra capacidad de sentarnos a dialogar en una mesa, sin patoterismos ni extorsiones. Ya demostramos que se puede. Lo hicimos con Vaca Muerta, con la lechería, con la carne, con la construcción, con el sector automotriz, con el sector forestal, con la biotecnología. ¿Qué hicimos? Nos sentamos a conversar, partiendo de la premisa de que todos los actores implicados, sindicatos, empresas y gobierno, debemos participar del diálogo. Y cada uno planteó su agenda de futuro, sus inquietudes y sus propuestas.
And so given, this pitch that President Macri is making, but also given the, major labor march that Hugo Moyano organized just weeks ago, what's your sense of where labor reform is headed, at least in the congressional landscape?
So in the congressional landscape, I think it's going to be very difficult to go much beyond the blanqueo laboral or la ley de inclusión laboral.
The amnesty.
Yes. What will probably happen, the major moves will happen in the collective bargaining negotiations. And I would call it like a stealth reform, because basically the government has been able to get a lot of unions in particular sectors to reform their collective contracts, which has been very positive for these sectors in terms of investment, et cetera. And he mentioned in the quote that we just heard, these sectors that have done this. And primarily his interest is in maintaining employment over salaries. But his big obstacle is the Moyano still. And the reason why that's the case is that they are the truckers union, and they're very resistant to changing their collective contract, which goes back to 1989. And so if you have a collective contract from 89 and the economic reality is very different today, obviously it's going to threaten Argentina's competitiveness. And so Macri basically needs to deal with Moyano, right, for the economy's overall well-being. The other problem is that if you do this sector-by-sector level reform, you're going to have a lot of disparity within sectors over time. So you may get some sectors that have higher levels of investment than other sectors, and workers that may have higher salaries, which actually does not bode well for the economy because it may create disequilibriums. For example, some sectors may need more investment, more imports, and the sectors that are export-oriented may not be exporting as much as they should to pay for those imports. So the optimal strategy is to have a labor reform through Congress that applies throughout all the sectors. But because of the high levels of labor unrest, it is probably not going to happen, at least in this congressional session.
And frankly, neither seems probable. I mean, the reason you're struggling in Congress is Moyano, and so trying in a bilateral manner to approach it doesn't seem more favorable than even going through the Congress, where he controls the sort of moderate Peronist bloc as well.
Yes, I would say that's true. The good news for Macri is that the CGT, a lot of the gordos, which is the more conservative parts of the labor movement, are basically creating a new labor organization, a new central, so to speak, to kick Moyano out, which will allow Macri to have a labor movement, the vast majority of which will be willing to negotiate with them. I'll talk more about that in a blog in the future. But yes, this is a very important news for Macri. There's not all downside. There is a potential upside. It depends on whether or not Moyano is able to force the issue, and if he can survive these judicial charges against him.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to reading more of your analysis on this important issue in the reform process.
Thank you.